In the wake of terrible flooding and adverse weather effects, such as that battering the top of the South Island right now, New Zealand's largest general insurer, IAG, has put forward a three-point plan it says will quickly reduce the risks of flooding of homes and communities. AIG New Zealand CEO Amanda Whiting is with me now. And Amanda, when we last talked to you, when NBR last talked to you, you told us that most people wanted to see more action in this space. And indeed, since then, the government has come out with its national adaptation plan. Is that not enough?
Thanks, Dita. Look, I think the National Adaptation Plan is a really good start, actually. But this is a very, very complex situation that we are facing into. And our three-phase plan is really just about trying to get us started. So we've got a lot of activity going on climate change, on reducing carbon, but actually there are communities right now, this week, that are facing challenges around flood. And we think this three-step plan can actually get put into place really quickly.
Okay, so let's talk about the three-point plan. The first one is a national policy statement. Tell us about that statement. What would that achieve?
The first step is actually a joint government and private entity piece of work, which is all around identifying the really high-level flood risk areas in New Zealand. When we're doing that, we're actually looking at where are the highest flood risk areas, what's been happening, what's been done so far, so has there been any mitigants put in place? And then lastly, in the local council, are there any plans around investment, or is there actually any funding for investment to help reduce flood risk? So that's the first stage.
Is there a consensus that you know of between insurers and the government about these issues? Because, I mean, that seems like a very basic thing that should have been done already.
I think the information exists now, Dita. It's about pulling it together and having the right overarching framework to get moving on it. So it's all there. We just need to get started.
Okay, but why have there been barriers to why has that not been done up until this point, do you think?
I think it's just really complex. And so that's why we've come out with this really pragmatic, simple three-stage plan that actually helps everyone get going on reducing the risk for the highest flood risk areas.
Okay, so the first prong to this attack that you've got with the government is a joint government-private sector project to build a common understanding of priority flood-prone communities. Now, can you just tell us about where that would take information that already exists?
Yeah, so effectively, we do have a lot of this information already. It's pulling it from all of the appropriate companies and putting that into one central point. And what we're hoping to identify is, first of all, what are the highest flood risk areas? Secondly, what mitigants have already been put in place in those areas? So is there anything that's been done already? And then lastly, what funding do local councils actually have in plan for dealing with those? Because many local councils have got small ratepayer funding and they actually don't have a solution. So understanding that's going to be really important.
And then the next step is a national policy statement to cease development of flood-prone areas, which is a slightly more contentious issue. Can you just tell us a little bit about how this might come about?
Yeah, look, it is contentious, but it actually is really important, because if we continue to develop and build homes on these really flood-prone areas, we're going to continue to see massive impacts to communities. And when I think about some development areas, many of them are young people starting out with small families. They've probably got large mortgages, and they don't have the funding to actually be resilient enough if there is a flood. So that's really important, I think. And also helping councils to be able to make that decision around whether land should be developed on or not. They're often the meat in the sandwich in all of this.
If insurers just stopped insuring people for building in these areas and developers for developing in these areas, wouldn't that achieve the same thing?
Yeah, we could do that. But I think our role as an insurer is to make sure we're available for all New Zealanders and actually to help reduce the risk. So this is one part of reducing that risk.
Right. Okay. And then, so the last part of it is a national program to invest in flood protection. Can you be specific and granular about what this might entail?
Sure. So once we've identified those really high flood risk areas, And this is riverine flooding, and what we can see is it's about 1% of New Zealand households that are at severe risk now. Putting together some funding to actually work through how we adapt in those communities is going to be important. Now, it could involve multiple things. It could involve retreat. It could involve building differently. And obviously, it would involve stopping developing in those areas.
So, I mean, we know, though, which areas are flooded a lot. We know, we know where it's probably dangerous to build. I mean, I just don't understand why these things that seem so obvious have not sort of been agreed upon up until this point.
Yeah, I agree. It is, but it is really complex. I have to remind everyone that it's not an easy situation to navigate through. I think the most important thing for me, though, is that these communities are experiencing hardship as a result of the environment that they're in. This week, we're seeing the west coast of the South Island experiencing, potentially for the fourth time, an evacuation. So those poor families are now packing their bags again to escape from a potential flood situation, and they've already experienced 3. So the devastation that causes from a physical perspective, so no one comes to any harm. The second one is from a mental perspective. Can you imagine the anxiety and the anguish around this happening again? And lastly, the financial risk, which is sort of where we come in. But I'm really a big believer in the more we can reduce the risk up front, the better communities will be.
Was the insurance sector properly consulted in the making of the government's mitigation plan that already exists?
We were consulted quite well, Dita. So we did have a lot of conversations. And again, we're coming out here because we're a leader in this market, and we see we have a role to play in protecting communities. So that's why we put together this really simple 3-stage plan.
Is this taken from other countries? Are other countries doing what you're proposing?
So I think there are different approaches to risk in different countries. I think New Zealand's quite unique, though. We've got lots of amazing rivers, some real challenges in terms of perils, and so I think we have an opportunity to come up with our own plan that really works for us.
What is the next step then? You've put out these ideas. What happens now?
So I think we'll get really positive response, actually. I think local councils are looking for some guidance here. They can see the problem, but on their own are unsure how to solve for it. I think government will be quite responsive. They've been positive in all the conversations that we've had with them. So we'll wait and see how that lands. But I do think, the best way to start is small and simple, and that's what we've proposed.
Right. Do you think the introduction of the Three Waters legislation is going to have an impact here?
I think it's quite separate, and the reason for that is because we're talking about riverine flooding here, and while drainage is really important in any flooding scenario, on the west coast of the South Island, wouldn't matter how much drainage you had, we'd still be exposed in those regions.
Is there a case for not developing those regions any further? I mean, are we looking in a few years for having parts of New Zealand uninsurable, uninhabitable, basically, because of climate change?
Yeah, I think if we don't do anything, absolutely. So if we don't take some steps now, there will be times where the properties won't be insurable. But this plan's actually getting in front of that. So I'm all about let's reduce the risk before we have the outcome. And this is what the plan is.
And how much money would be needed for this national program, do you think? And how much of that would come from industry and how much from government, roughly?
I don't know the number yet, Dita, but I think the first stage is actually understanding how many of these properties are at risk and where they are, and then working with local central government and other interested organisations to see how we can fund it.
And you believe that the government is open to what you're suggesting here?
I think we're all looking for the right solution, and I think the government will listen. And so it'll be really interesting what happens over the next few days.
Great. Amanda, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Dita.